Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and wait just a few more minutes to let others join, and then we'll get started with today's discussion. Good afternoon again, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started today. So welcome to the latest installment of Post-Secondary Pathways, Exploring State Funding for Higher Education in Fiscal Year 2021. For those unfamiliar with the Hunt Institute, we were founded by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt and serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues across the education spectrum. My name is Dr. Madeline Smith, and I am the Director of Higher Education at the Hunt Institute. Before getting the conversation started, I do want to provide a brief logistical overview. First, we will have a 10-minute presentation on the 2021 Fiscal Year State Higher Education Finance Report. We will then have about a 30-minute moderated discussion with our panelists before pivoting to an audience Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address them during the discussion. Additionally, we will record this conversation and post it on our YouTube channel for folks to view afterwards. For those attending today's discussion, we also encourage you to share the conversation on social media using the hashtag #postpathways. I am excited to introduce today's moderator, Sophia Lederman. Sophia is the Associate Vice President at SHEO, where she leads research and policy related to state higher education finance. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the floor over to you, Sophia.
Thank you, Madeline, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for hosting this discussion. My name again is Sophia Lederman, and I'm an Associate Vice President at SHEO. SHEO stands for the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association. SHEO is the national membership organization for statewide governing, policy, and coordinating boards of public post-secondary education. We work to equip state higher education executive officers and their staffs with the tools to effectively advance the public value of higher education, provide information and analysis on educational and public policy issues, and serve as an advocate for state higher education leadership. The State Higher Education Finance Report, or the SHEF report, as we call it, is one of the many different tools that SHEO provides to advance post-secondary education. The SHEF report has been published annually by SHEO since 2003, and it's the primary source for longitudinal state-level data on state and local funding for higher education. We collect data on government funding, tuition revenue, and enrollment directly from our member agencies in each state. The report examines trends, contexts, and consequences of state higher education funding decisions made in each state. So Kelsey Kunkel, a policy analyst at SHEO and one of the co-authors of the SHEF report, is going to provide an overview of findings from the 2021 SHEF report before we dive deeper into the discussion with some of our resource experts. So with that, Kelsey, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sophia. And as she mentioned, my name is Kelsey Kunkel. I'm a policy analyst here at SHEO, and I'll be talking a little bit about the highlights from our latest SHEF report for fiscal year 2021. So the elevator pitch version of this year's national level state funding to higher education story is that state funding surpassed expectations with a 4.5% increase in education appropriations. However, this was accompanied by generous federal stimulus funding that protected state budgets and a sharp decline in student enrollment and tuition revenue, signaling continued upheaval for public higher education revenue. But overall, there were three factors contributing to this finding. The first is enrollment changes. The second is federal stimulus funding. And the third is states' commitments to higher education. So in the past, enrollment has generally increased following the economic recession. But this year, that trend reversed following the brief recession in 2020. So 2021 marks the 10th consecutive year of enrollment declines. And in this 2021 year, the nation experienced a 3% decline in FTE enrollment. This is the largest decline in net FTE since the start of the SHEF data collection in 1980. And this enrollment decline was concentrated at the two-year public institutions, which reported a 6.1% decline, while the four-year public institutions reported a 0.9% decline. So federal stimulus funding cushioned state budgets and boosted education appropriations in 2021. And due to the pandemic, many predicted declines in state support in most states between 2020 and 2021. In part, this predicted decline didn't occur due to the $3.7 billion in federal stimulus funding that states chose to disperse to higher education. And in 2021, all but 5 states allocated federal stimulus to higher ed. And these funds wound up making up 3.2% of state and local funding to higher ed, contributing $214 per FTE in public operating to two-year institutions and $288 per FTE to four-year institutions. Before I move on, it's also important to note that all the federal stimulus funds that we collected for the SHEF report were those that were distributed to states, then allocated by the states to higher ed, further showing their commitment to higher education. So as I mentioned earlier, per student education appropriations increased this year. State and local governments provided $9,327 per student to public institutions, which is an increase of $400 per FTE, or 4.5% in inflation-adjusted education appropriations. Without federal stimulus funds, inflation-adjusted per student education appropriations would have increased by only 2%. And had FTE enrollment held constant and had states not directed federal stimulus funds toward higher ed, education appropriations would actually have declined 1% this year. So this US wave chart shows state funding and tuition revenue on an inflation-adjusted per FTE basis from 1980 to 2021. In this figure, the red line shows enrollment trends, while the light blue bars on the bottom represent education appropriations per FTE, and the green bars on top represent net tuition revenue per FTE. Historically, reductions during economic recessions led to lower state education appropriations per FTE, but these funds have broadly increased over time, showing a change in recent years. And FTE enrollment, which again is represented by that red line, has generally increased over the last 40 years and usually has increased most sharply during recessionary periods. However, this trend changed with a 3% decline in 2021. So over time, recessions have had steeper impacts on state funding for higher education, and recoveries have been shallower. This figure shows the cumulative annual percent change in public higher education appropriations per FTE following economic recessions from 1980 to 2021. The recession periods are represented by the gray bars, and each line starts in a recession. So the dips show declines, and the increases and recoveries are shown with the increasing lines. In most states, federal stimulus funding helped fill state budget shortfalls in 2021, reducing the need to defer funding from higher ed to other budget areas. However, in many states, state funding never recovered from the 2001 and 2008 recessions. 29 states have actually not yet recovered from the 2008 Great Recession, meaning that their education appropriations per FTE in 2021 remain below 2008 levels. And in 36 states, education appropriations per FTE remain below the level seen in 2001 prior to the tech bust. So this figure shows public higher education financial aid per FTE and state financial aid as a percent of education appropriations from 2001 to 2021. In 2021, state public financial aid rose 8.8%, reaching an all-time high of $921 per FTE. And as this figure shows, financial aid has steadily increased over the last 2 decades. In 2021, state public financial aid made up the largest percentage of state appropriations to date at 9.9%. Total education revenue reached an all-time high thanks to federal stimulus funding. Nationally, total education revenue increased 1.1% in 2021, reaching an all-time high of $15,959 per FTE. However, without federal stimulus funding, total education revenue would have declined 0.3%. Total revenue only reached a record high in 18 states and varied substantially by institution type, showing that the story is not the same everywhere. So four-year institutions had 1.51 times the total revenue of two-year institutions. So this figure shows total education revenue for 2021, including the variation in where education revenue comes from in each state. So on the right side of this figure are the states with the highest total education revenues. And the lengths of each of these bars show that some of the high revenue states like Vermont, Michigan, and Delaware are mostly funded by student tuition, which is represented by those green bars on top. Whereas states like Illinois, Wyoming, and then Washington, D.C. mostly rely on state funding, which is represented by the blue bars on the bottom. So looking ahead to fiscal year 2022, we're able to provide these early look data collection from our Grapevine report. And these data basically suggest that student support for higher education reached $105.4 billion, and including the $7.2 billion in federal state funds that states receive, or in federal stimulus funds that states received over the last 3 years. States reported an increase of 6.6% in support to higher ed. And excluding the federal stimulus funds, this increase in state support was 8.3%, with only 5 states having declines. And including federal stimulus, 33 states reported increases in state support to higher education in 2022. And those the largest increases, which are all above 10%, were in California, Colorado, Louisiana, Nevada, and Texas. And while we're excited to present an early look of fiscal year 2022, I would like to caution that these amounts are not final. We also don't have 2022 enrollment data for states, nor are these amounts adjusted by inflation or adjusted for inflation. And at this point, we do anticipate inflation affecting these increases a great deal. So I'd also like to show you where you can access these data as well as our online report. So from our main SHEF website, which is that first link at the top, you can access both the interactive and PDF versions of the report. One key difference between these two versions is that in the online interactive SHEF report, you can customize figures. You can also customize figures on the data downloads page, which is the second link. And on that page, you can also download the full data set, a sector level data set, as well as all data sets and images of all tables and figures throughout the report. And then to wrap up, I would like to show you an example of a state profile, which is another key feature of the SHEF website and that last link at the bottom. So this is an example of what a state profile looks like. However, this is only the top of the page. So if you scroll down, you'll be able to see text and customizable figures for each data element that we measure in the SHEF report. I'd also like to point out that menu on the left-hand side, and you can use this to adjust the state profile to compare your state to different region, states, and state compacts instead of the US. You can also change the years as well as data adjustments to account for inflation and state differences of cost of living and enrollment. So thanks for listening. I hope you all found this helpful.
Thank you, Kelsey, for that presentation. So now I'd like to introduce Ben Cannon. Ben is the Executive Director at the Oregon Higher Education Coordinating Commission, where he oversees the state's primary entity responsible for ensuring pathways to post-secondary education success for Oregonians statewide. In addition, Ben is a former teacher, state representative elected 3 times to the Oregon House of Representatives, and education policy advisor to the governor. Director Cannon, thank you for being here today. Could you please share how funding for higher education in Oregon has fared over your tenure, and what are some of the major trends you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sophia and Kelsey, for the great presentation, and appreciate the opportunity to spotlight some of Oregon's funding history. I'd say the simple way of understanding the Oregon story is to sort of take all of the trends that Kelsey described for the nation and then sharpen them, heighten them. And that's been Oregon's experience. And that's true not only over the last year, which was the primary focus of the presentation you just saw, but it's really true over the past decade. And I'll refer back, since you mentioned over my tenure, I've been in this job almost 9 years. And if you go back to 2011, which was slightly before I started, Oregon was about at the bottom of the pack in terms of state funding for post-secondary education on a per student basis. And in the decades since, we've experienced one of the highest, greatest rates of increase in that sort of key SHEF measure, and we're now ranked 36th in the country. So we've seen about a 57% increase in per student public support for post-secondary education. That's the good news. But as Kelsey suggested, that per student per FTE expression of public investment in post-secondary education takes into account not only state and local public investment, which is increasing in Oregon, but also enrollment, which has declined in Oregon. And so we have experienced enrollment declines over the past 10 years, particularly in our two-year sector, that are 2 to 3 times the national average. So when you combine our sort of modestly increasing state public appropriations with really pretty sharp enrollment declines, Oregon jumps that 57% on the per FTE measure. So I think we have both a positive story to tell about Oregon's experience in terms of public support for post-secondary education, and a concerning one when you consider the contribution that enrollment declines have played. It's also worth noting that, at 36th in the country, it is clearly the case that Oregon still lags the national average on that measure by quite a bit. So while we've climbed from the bottom, or very nearly the bottom, we still have a long way to go even to reach the national average. The other sort of highlight that I'd like to sort of extract from the SHEF report as it relates to Oregon is in terms of total resources for revenue for our institutions. So the SHEF report includes a focus on state and local public appropriations, and that's what's expressed in that climb that Oregon has made. But it also captures, as one of Kelsey's slides indicated, also captures total institutional revenues. And of course, besides the state and local support for our post-secondary institutions, students contribute significantly through tuition. And on that measure, the SHEF report is also, I think, really interesting and useful for Oregon policymakers and policymakers around the country, because it tells a story where Oregon now, as of 2021, this report equals the national average in terms of total resources per student FTE for our institutions. So when you combine tuition revenues, which have also grown substantially over the time period that we're describing, with the public investment, which, as I've noted, has grown, Oregon institutions now enjoy, if I can use that word, about the national average in terms of total revenue on a per student basis. So the report is tremendously useful. I think those are some of the highlights for Oregon, and look forward to sharing more and being part of the discussion as we continue this afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. So as a reminder for everyone, please submit questions for any of the panelists using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will move to your questions in a couple minutes. So next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Jennifer Delaney. Dr. Delaney is an associate professor of higher education in the Department of Education, Policy, Organization, and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's also a member of the Illinois Board of Higher Education. Dr. Delaney's research focuses on higher education policy with an emphasis on finance, student financial aid, and state budgeting for higher education. Dr. Delaney, thank you for joining us for this discussion. Given your research and work on higher education finance, what are some of the major trends you've been following, and how does the SHEF report add credence to these trends?
So thank you for that nice introduction, Sophia. I'm really glad to join us. I'm really glad Hunt Institute organized this panel, and that we've got such an illustrious group to think about SHEV and think about what's going on with state funding for higher education. So as I think about the report from this year and also from prior years, looking in the long term, it seems to me that funding for states fall into a fairly predictable pattern where higher education is serving as a balance wheel for state budgets. So Hal Hovey was a longtime state budget analyst in California and first put forth this idea of the balance wheel. My colleague Will Doyle at Vanderbilt and I have researched it and provided some evidence that he was onto something, and this really does work as a pattern for higher ed funding. But the basic idea is that higher education falls into a countercyclical pattern and is very responsive to the business cycle as states experience economic ups and downs. And higher ed's a very attractive area for spending during sort of good economic times when things are going well. But higher ed's also one of the first areas on the chopping block when we hit recessions or other times of economic downturns. So this year's SHEF report shows some evidence of this. I think Kelsey really nicely went through those recessionary periods and also made the important point that it's not symmetric. So the cuts during bad times tend to be bigger than the increases during good times. And we've had a general sort of ratcheting down of state support for higher education. There are some structural issues in state budgets that make me think that this trend or this pattern of the balance wheel is likely to hang around for some time. And there's nothing that I'm seeing in the SHEF report that indicates either we're out of the balance wheel or that that's no longer relevant as sort of a conceptual frame for thinking about how states fund higher education. So one of the structural issues is that in most states, higher ed is the largest remaining discretionary spending category within a state budget. And if it's not number one, it's number two or number three. So it's big. A lot of other state budget categories have moved from the discretionary to the non-discretionary side of the budget. They've done this either through court cases in the K-12 sector, ensuring K-12 funding, or just moving by way of having federal matching, ongoing federal matching programs from discretionary to non-discretionary. But as a big budget item that is discretionary, when we hit downturns, higher ed's very often one of the first on the chopping block. The other thing that higher ed can do that most other state budget categories can't do is it raises outside revenue. And we do that by raising tuition and fees on students, right? And the SHEF report very nicely includes how that's going and how much more reliant institutions are on that student and family supported funds through tuitions. I think many institutions now sort of view tuition revenues as being more stable than their state budget appropriations. And I think that's a really interesting shift. It's very unlikely that other state budget categories are going to develop these alternative revenue streams. So politically, it sort of feels like maybe it hurts less if higher ed is cut because it has the ability to raise this outside revenue. We know that has incredibly important impacts on college access, particularly for low-income students. But that tends to keep playing out time after time within a state budget context because it seems to hurt less to cut higher ed than other budget categories. The other sort of structural feature I think is important to mention is that every state, 49 of them except for Vermont, have balanced budget requirements, which is going to push states that when we do hit recessionary periods or downturns, they will need to cut. Most states don't have very large rainy day funds. There aren't reserves sitting around to help weather sort of economic downturns. We'll talk a little bit later on about the role of federal stimulus, and I'm glad that Kelsey brought that up earlier. But between the balanced budget requirements that is going to necessitate state cuts, higher ed being that largest discretionary or one of the largest discretionary budget categories, and their ability to raise outside revenues, my guess is we're going to continue seeing higher ed serve as a balance wheel within state budgets, and we're going to continue seeing this evidence that we've seen thus far in SHEV about that relationship between the business cycle and particularly those cuts during recessionary periods as states budget for higher education.
Thank you so much, Dr. Delaney. So Ben, as a SHEO, how are you able to leverage information such as the SHEF report to advocate for institutions in your, to advocate for institutions to policymakers and elected officials in your state? And where have you found success doing this?
Yeah, thanks. And I'll get to that in a sec. First, I just really want to underscore the point Dr. Delaney made about how lawmakers tend to view the higher education budgets, and in particular, the fact that other revenues, namely tuition revenues, do help, I think, lawmakers, in effect, get away with higher education cuts without feeling the full pain. In effect, they're passed on to students and not necessarily as directly experienced in terms of layoffs of public employees or other workers when colleges and universities have the opportunity to raise revenue via tuition. I think, if we enter a recessionary cycle or state budget contractions, it'll be interesting. Well, it'll be important to see how that plays out in an era where tuition has already increased as high as it is, and so many students are already sort of at the breaking point. In terms of leveraging the SHEF for policymakers, it's an enormously important report. I mean, there's just nothing like it in terms of benchmarking state performance against other states and against the nation as a whole. And in our experience, lawmakers are quite interested in knowing how their state is doing. So specifically, I mean, we use the national and state by state comparisons. We've focused recently, particularly on financial aid, and SHEF, as Kelsey noted, SHEF does sort of highlight or single out that portion of the state appropriation and compare it state by state and to the nation as a whole. So in Oregon, for example, in the 2021 report, we as a state invest about $570 per student in state-based financial aid compared with a national average of $921. So that's a big gap. Even more sort of attention getting, I think, for Oregonians is that our neighbor to the north, the state of Washington, invests nearly $2,000 in per student state financial aid. I mean, that's pretty remarkable given that that's an average across all of their FTE and their public sector. So we've brought that to a lot of policymakers. California, our neighbors to the south, also significantly surpass us in that measure. And it is a way of helping tell a story, help build a case, help motivate through, in that case, I guess, a little bit of shaming, and encourage our lawmakers to improve state investments in financial aid and in student success and institutional success. The other measure that I'll point out that I think, at least for our purposes as it relates to student access and affordability, is particularly compelling, is going back to the share of total higher educational costs that are paid by the public versus by students. And SHEF, it goes way back, and one of the, we can use this report to help draw out these trends that are not just year or decade, but multi-decade. And so if you go back, for example, to the year 2001, in Oregon, it was the case that students were responsible for about 36% of their total educational costs, again, across multiple sectors and big average. Today, that number has increased in spite of the state investment increases. That number has increased. The student responsibility is now 54%. So we can very clearly and compellingly, to any lawmaker who may be operating on the basis of their experience, right, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, we can compellingly say via SHEF, with SHEF at our side, we can say that, in fact, it is the case today that Oregon students pay the majority of their educational costs. The public, the taxpayer, is in the back seat now, and that has all kinds of implications, not only for affordability, but also for policy and for accountability and for et cetera. So I think those are some of the ways that we've tried to use the report to tell a compelling story to state lawmakers about the need. Again, though, going back to Dr. Delaney's comments about kind of political realities and the way that that higher education funding typically plays that balancing wheel kind of role, I think it's hard to overcome that, but through some amount of persuasion, through leveraging information like SHEF includes, I think we're able to make some difference in those outcomes.
Thank you, Ben. So Dr. Delaney, you talked a bit already about how higher education is treated as a balance wheel in state budgets. But unlike what many experts expected, given these past patterns, and despite the 2020 recession, both 2021 and 2022 seem to have much stronger state support than many people thought. But obviously 2 years of strong state support doesn't eliminate these long-term trends and issues with state funding. So I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit more on some of your concerns for higher education finance moving forward.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Sophia. I think it's really important to think about. And what I want to talk about with this is really thinking about the notion of volatility in state funding. But I want to start where you did and where Kelsey set us up so well, in really thinking about why 2021 and 22 didn't go as expected, did not go certainly as I predicted. And the real story there is about federal stimulus funding. This $3.7 billion in direct federal stimulus funds, some states had additional funds that came through governor's offices, were incredibly important in sort of keeping higher education afloat. And we did not know at the beginning of the pandemic that was going to happen, that there would be those federal funds coming in. I think a really important component of it is not just that the money was there, but that in each of the 3 waves of stimulus funding, there were maintenance of effort provisions, and there was guidance from the federal government about how to spend. So it wasn't just money that could become a pass-through, but it required states to sort of maintain what they were doing, at least at a minimal level, and not be severely cutting higher education. tuition. The good news is during the pandemic and also earlier during the Great Recession, when we had the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009, the evidence is that the states followed the rules. And when there was a maintenance of effort provision, higher ed was treated differently politically within state budgets, even facing economic downturns. I also think it's important to note how this mattered in terms of sort of smoothing out the countercyclical nature of higher ed funding, right? Unlike states, the federal government can borrow. And when we hit economic downturns, they have the ability to sort of smooth out those valleys of funding that we've typically seen during recessionary periods. The other big component about this is to really think about student aid and to look at the federal Pell Grant program, which as a quasi-entitlement is structured to serve countercyclically. So when we hit economic downturns, more people are struggling. And because they're struggling, they have lower income. So they qualify for larger, if they apply and are awarded a Pell Grant, they qualify for larger awards. And we also have more students qualifying for those awards, but no one's ever turned away with Pell money. In Illinois, where I'm based, we have a strong need-based grant aid program called the MAP Awards, Monetary Awards Program, but we've been running out of money for years. We had a huge appropriations this year. It's wonderful to have that, but it was first come, first serve. And we were shortchanging in those moments where families are struggling the most to be able to afford tuition, to re-enter into higher education or enter for the first time. We're not only cutting institutions through appropriations, but we're also generally cutting student aid programs. And that really squeezes families. And one of the counterpoints is that federal money, the federal Pell money that's coming in and serving that sort of counterpoint to be a smoothing mechanism for low-income students. So in this world, we're seeing sort of volatility become a story, and it's something I think we need to attend to beyond just levels of funding and beyond thinking about where we are in this year, but rather what that pattern of funding has been. I did some work with Will Doyle at Vanderbilt and one of his students, Amber Lee Dazinski, who's now at UW-Madison. And we found not only a lot of volatility in the system when we looked back over time, but the intensity of the volatility has been increasing, particularly when we compare today to the 80s and 90s. And we want to worry about those consequences of volatility as well, right? For institutions, it's really hard to, with one of your primary revenue streams tied up in the state, to be volatile and to not know what you're going to get year to year. Many states require institutions to return funds at the end of the fiscal year. So you're stuck in this, you've got to spend within a year and return money, and you can't smooth things year to year. Institutions, being very rationally risk averse, engage in some behaviors that maybe aren't in the best interests of students and families, or even intellectual pursuits, right? So I think the increased use of, say, adjunct and contingent faculty at relatively low wages is in part tied to the risk that is inherent in operating in a very volatile environment. And we've got some evidence that that can start to impact educational quality, particularly at the undergraduate level. In the historic patterns, we'll talk maybe a little bit later about what Kelsey raised with enrollments not behaving like they have for every other recession since World War II in this country during the pandemic. But typically when we hit a recession, enrollments increase. So you have a moment for institutions where enrollments are going up, you've got more students, the state is cutting your operating budget through appropriations, and state student aid is being cut. So you're expected to do more with less, and very quickly in the higher ed sector, that ends up being a trade-off in quality, and the educational quality is declining during economic downturns. Or we want to be worried about that, right? We want to be worried about some of these structures, and also just what that impact of volatility has on institutions. I think this also has, I mean, not to pontificate as a professor here, but I think it has had implications also within institutions about the areas of knowledge that we are investing in. And increasingly, institutions are looking for high revenue generating degree programs. We've seen an explosion of MBA programs, particularly online ones, particularly in the last decade or so. And we haven't seen that same explosion in fields that produce really important social goods, but maybe aren't revenue generating for the institution and also maybe don't lead to high wages. My field of education and training teachers or social work would be some good examples of that. So we've ended up in a volatile system where some of the consequences have the potential to be eroding educational quality and also to be eroding some of the public goods that higher education produces. The other thing to point out with volatility is that it doesn't impact all institutions equally. Those institutions that are more dependent on state funding for their operating revenues, which tend to be our open access community colleges, regional institutions, are going to feel the impact of a budgetary cut more than flagships do. In addition, those tend to be the institutions that serve more of our low-income students. So when there are cuts to state student aid programs, particularly need-based aid programs, they're also going to feel the brunt of that as well, and feel that in a way that's different than a flagship institution. And we want to worry about that, right? We want to worry about having these differential impacts of living in the same volatile environment across different sectors, and what that means for a state's ability to produce a well-educated workforce, to produce a well-educated citizenry, what that means for access and opportunity and pricing. And then ultimately those things that we worry may be impacted by volatility, like quality and the erosion of the public good. So I'll mention, not to do my own plug here, but I'm working on a book on this. Sophia is graciously one of the authors in this edited volume, but we're really looking to explore this concept of volatility and try to bring that notion into some policy discussions as we think about the ways in which higher ed is funded, and if it really needs to be on a year-to-year basis that can be this crazy roller coaster ride as we've seen in the past, or if there might be different ways of approaching it in the future.
Thank you so much, Dr. Delaney. I think those are some really important points. I want to turn to Ben to get some of his responses and thoughts on some of those points you made. So Ben, Dr. Delaney mentioned a little bit earlier that given the volatility in state funding, perhaps public institutional leaders might feel like tuition revenue is actually a more stable and consistent revenue source than state funding. I think this has very important implications for considering how tuition rates might change moving forward and the decisions institutions might make about tuition rate increases. So I'm curious if you would agree that this is the case for public institutions in Oregon.
Yeah, I'll give probably an unsatisfying answer, which is that I think it depends on the institution. So certainly for our flagship universities, land grant university in Oregon, University of Oregon, and Oregon State University, that have more tools to meet their enrollment targets, maintain stable enrollment, have more opportunities to generate out-of-state student tuition revenue, and have probably greater pricing power in the market. There's no question that tuition revenue is really the stable bedrock of their institutional budgets, right? And the state investment is necessary and important, but it is far less dependable, and there's no question they look at it that way. Unfortunately, we've got a lot of other institutions in Oregon that are subject to much greater levels of enrollment variation and therefore tuition revenue variation, and are seeing volatility not only on the state side and uncertainty with respect to the state investment, but also volatility and uncertainty in terms of tuition revenue and enrollment. So I think it's a little bit of both. And I think the more sort of the most profound factor, and it's been well described and well documented, well studied, is the fact that and Oregon is a sort of an exemplar in the worst kind of way of this long-term trend to using tuition revenue as the primary revenue source for institutions, with with declining proportions of public and institutional or public support for institutions and students. And that has all kinds of consequences in terms of higher education.
Thank you. Yeah, that's some really helpful context. So my next question is for all three of our panelists. Each of you works with a robust population from state policymakers to students and practitioners, and these populations overlap with our audience today. So what are some key takeaways from the SHEF report that maybe we haven't delved as far into as you'd like to make sure the audience takes away from this webinar? And let's start with Dr. Delaney.
Sure. So one of my big key takeaways, and it's something I'm so pleased to see in the SHEF report, is that it's now disaggregated by sector. Like we really can start to talk about these differences between how flagships and 4 years fare versus community colleges, the experience of different institutions within their own state context, within the same political context and same budget, just is not the same thing. Executive Director Ben mentioned how flagship institutions are in a different market space than most open access institutions, and that matters for their ability to raise these outside revenues. And the market space that institutions recruiting out-of-state students is profoundly different than institutions that are locally or regionally based and may have students of more limited means attending. So the differences in reliance on state appropriations really varies by institution. The difference in student population served and what those needs of students are really varies. The difference in reliance on student aid, particularly need-based grant aid programs from the states, really matter. And I think it's important that now we can talk about that. We can use data to start shedding light on these different stories. I mentioned my work earlier with Dr. Doyle and Amberly Dazinski on volatility, and we showed clear differences that, particularly for community colleges, their experience of state budgets is incredibly more volatile than in the 4-year sector. And the ability to have SHEF data to bring to bear on that, to really get into it and talk about those differences across sectors. You know, in general, I might argue we've had profound underinvestment in our workforce institutions, our regional comprehensives, our open access institutions, our community colleges. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think both the collection of the data and then the ability to shine light on this and to really disaggregate things by sector in a comparable way, which obviously SHEF gives us very nicely comparisons across the 50 states, is just really important to highlight, and something that's going to make SHEF even a more valuable tool going forward.
Thank you. Let's go to Kelsey next.
Sophia. So there are two things that I hope the audience will take away from this webinar. And the first thing is that the enrollment changes in 2021, as we've all talked about, really defied previous trends following recessions. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, enrollment has generally increased following economic recessions, but in 2021, most states actually saw declines in one or both of their sectors, and 2-year institutions took the hardest hit, which is really important for higher education and institution leaders to think about when they're considering these major enrollment changes. Another takeaway, which in my opinion is the most important one, is that increase in state and local funding in 2021. So because of the brief recession in 2020, many people expected per student education appropriations to increase, and which, as Dr. Delaney described, was for good reason, since the state and local funds, public higher ed, tend to be the first budget area on that chopping block during economic hardships, because unlike other public sectors within the state budgets, institutions of higher education have access to other revenue sources like student tuition. But in 2021, we found the opposite. So instead of decreases, we saw increases. And as we've all emphasized throughout this webinar, federal stimulus funding played a significant role in this. But these are funds that states had to choose to spend on higher education or to avoid budget cuts to higher ed. So this really shows that many states were committed to higher ed by choosing to put these stimulus funds or their own state and local funds toward maintaining or increasing levels of funding that they put toward higher ed. But it's also really important to give this finding within the context that most states still haven't fully recovered from the 2001 and 2008 recessions. So it's really, really important that state higher education agencies and institution leaders start advocating for public higher education now, especially since it looks like we might be facing another economic recession in 2022. And one way that we can advocate for maintaining and increasing higher ed funding is by making connections to workforce development and how higher ed can help the nation out of a recession and getting states back into better financial positions sooner. And so anyone in the audience who's interested in advocating for state funding for higher ed, you can use these data from the SHEF report, especially those state profiles that I showed at the end of the presentation that are available on our website. And you can use these to show where your state stands compared to past funding levels for your state, as well as other states in your region and the nation as a whole.
Thank you. And finally, Ben, some key takeaways from the SHEF report you'd like the audience to take away.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, I think that there's a potential for misinterpretation of kind of the headline findings. And I want to focus on that as a takeaway. So the headline is that state public investment on a per student basis increased over the last year. And it did. In Oregon, again, we saw a 10% increase on that measure. And so one would think, seeing that our state investment increased 10% per FTE over the last year, you would think that our institutions would be doing great, right? Would have these great budgets. When you pair that, or because part of that 10% is driven by enrollment declines, you kind of have to look at the whole picture, at least to understand institutional budget well-being. So a community college, for example, that saw a 10% increase in state funding, but saw a 25% decrease in student enrollment, and therefore roughly a 25% decrease in tuition revenue, is in a world of hurt, notwithstanding the increase in public investment. And that is the case for a number of our institutions, particularly outside the flagship. So it's I think it's just important to sort of see all of that. It's all in the report, much to SHEO's credit, and I just emphasize looking past the headline.
Thank you so much. So we are now going to turn to the audience Q&A. If you haven't yet, please use the Q&A feature to ask our panelists questions. Ben, the first question is for you. So it says, Oregon shows a wide gap between average 4-year funding versus 2-year funding, especially compared to states like Washington and California. So I'm hoping you could address that, and also maybe just talk more broadly about how state funding differs in Oregon based on the type of institution.
Yeah, I mean, this year's report's really interesting because it does contain the sector by sector breakout for the first time, and it does allow us to make these comparisons. And the questioner is correct that when you index Oregon to the national average or to our neighbors, it appears that our per student funding for our 4-year sector is well below our comparators, and our 2-year sector is above. Again, because that's expressed, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, but because that's expressed on a per student basis, and because our community colleges have experienced such extraordinary enrollment declines over the last couple of years, greater than almost any other place in the country, that apparently sort of rosy figure for community colleges is the result in part of those enrollment declines. And so I think it's still an important measure, and it's a good way of benchmarking Oregon relative to other states. But the context, particularly if you're trying to understand institutional budgets of enrollment declines, is really, really important. There are also definitional differences in terms of how which students SHEF counts for the purposes of those per FTE numbers. So for example, when we describe community college enrollment in Oregon, we typically include a number of non-credit students that we think it's important for the state to help fund. They may be adult basic skills students, they may be English as a second language students that our community colleges are serving and the state is helping to support. The SHEF report excludes, if I'm correct, I think I am, the SHEF report excludes those in its FTE counts, and that helps to drive up the per student public investment number in our community colleges. There are other differences that I think are important to making sense of the distinction, but we're still digesting that what appears to be a real discrepancy between Oregon and some of its neighbors in the nation on those measures.
Thank you. And yes, that is correct that the SHEF report excludes non-credit students from our FTE calculations. So another question for Ben. How have you seen changes in Oregon's public funding affect policy implementation? So have institutions begun to ignore or discount legislators' funding emphases as that funding has come to represent less of their budgets?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and folks who have any experience with or familiarity with the Oregon story will know that almost 10 years ago now, the legislature decided to grant our public universities a much greater degree of autonomy from the state than they had previously had when they were treated as a state agency and really overseen directly by the state. And so our entire governance system changed. And I think one of the ways of understanding kind of the forces that resulted in that action in 2013 was the declining public investment. And it sort of, you lose, I think the argument for greater levels of autonomy grows for institutions as public investment declines. You know, I could probably describe other sort of more specific examples of where there have been policy implications for where declining public funding has resulted in policy changes. Institutions ignore the legislature at their peril, right? I think that's putting it too strongly, right? Even if there was $0 of public investment in our institutions, they would still be subject to state law. Legislators would still have their peeves. They would still have their bills, and institutions would be wise to pay attention, and I think they do.
Thank you. Dr. Delaney, what trends are you seeing emerge kind of looking forward that you expect to be topics of conversation in upcoming years?
So I'll just highlight what Kelsey's already very carefully walked us through, but I think we need to keep talking about why enrollments did not behave during the pandemic like they have during other recessionary periods. The National Student Clearinghouse is estimating we've lost about 1 million students, and we don't know yet. We don't know, is this just a lost generation? They're not going to return later, not have the same educational opportunities. There's very good public health related reasons for why people wouldn't want to be going to school, but I don't think that fully explains it. And I think we've got more unanswered questions about why enrollment patterns changed during the pandemic than we have answers for. And I think it's going to take some time to sort all that out and figure it out. But I think it's really important to talk about that. And I mean, I think we heard from Ben very nicely describing how an institution's enrollment declines, even if your appropriations are going up, does not make for a healthy institution. And it's also really important to sort of tease out what's happening in terms of what it means for college access, what it means for the supports we should be giving to students to make sure that there are post-secondary pathways for individuals either returning to college or getting that first chance at a post-secondary degree. So I think we'll be noodling on that for quite some time, trying to figure out why that one looks different.
Thank you. So we have a question. It's not directed to any particular panelist. So anyone who'd like to answer, please jump in. It says, is it likely we will see public-private partnerships in high-need fields to support investments in education, given that there are 11 million unfilled jobs in the USA and many require 21st century college skills? Tennessee seems to be an example of this, with local businesses partnering with the technical colleges.
We certainly have examples of some of that local partnership already, particularly with our community colleges, but also our universities, partnerships between employers and the institution that's providing the training. We haven't replicated that at a state level. I know there are other states that have gone farther in that direction. And it feels like the moment where if something like that's going to occur, it would be at a time where employers are, many of them desperate for graduates that can fill the jobs that are currently vacant, and for which there isn't an immediate supply coming out of our colleges and universities. In my experience, we haven't seen employers coming to the table directly with dollars, right? Partnership and interest in legislation, interest in helping support state investment, even in some cases interest in supporting tax revenue to support those efforts. But private investment at scale to meet workforce needs is not something that we've really experienced yet in Oregon.
So if I can jump into, I think it's an interesting question to think about the public-private partnerships. We have seen a huge growth in this, and the area where the most growth has actually been in capital appropriations. There are many states where you can't build a building even at a public institution anymore unless some private funding is brought to the table. And that really shifts what it means to be a state institution. And we're seeing sort of this increasing stratification across institutions between those that have wealthy alums where they can raise funds to be able to leverage state funds for capital projects and those that can't. We've also seen investment in these P3 partnerships. So an example of this would be a private company building a residence hall on a campus, but they're managing it. And some odd things popped up during the pandemic, like institutional autonomy was limited in how they could enforce pandemic-related safety protocols, move students to single occupancy as opposed to double occupancy, masking, requiring vaccines, when there was this other private entity that was a profit-focused entity. And those tensions, I think, are likely to continue. I think in terms of instructional programs, where we've seen most of the partnerships has been in like healthcare fields and other places where we have some issues about equipment costs being so expensive that often you need multiple entities to be able to purchase. So in healthcare fields, a common example is in training programs that require like an MRI machine. It's really out of reach for most community colleges to buy their own, but if you can pay for a third of it and have the state come in and have a hospital system come in and do those sorts of trainings, that can be really beneficial. And I think those sort of high tech, high need, really expensive equipment areas is going to continue and in some ways necessitate some partnerships. This can lead to wonderful outcomes for students because they're clear employment pathways. They actually get trained on the things that they're going to be working on when they enter the workforce. But it also raises some of these other issues about who has control. Where do things live? How do we think about the student experience and what does that mean with institutional autonomy? But my guess is this will continue in all of these spaces, both capital and through instructional programs.
Thank you. So our next question is for Ben. Dr. Delaney mentioned that the volatility of institution budgets can lead to a decline in things like academic quality with universities hiring adjunct faculty, for example. Is this something you've seen play out at Oregon institutions kind of throughout your tenure?
Yeah, I mean, there's no question that Oregon institutions rely more heavily on adjunct faculty, for example, than they did 10 or 20 years ago. I am cautious about making a direct link to quality. And I know Dr. Delaney sort of emphasized the impact that these funding trends can have on institutional quality. I remain very confident, and I see plenty of evidence that the quality of the educational experience that our students receive, particularly the academic quality at our public colleges and universities, has not worsened. Yes, there is a greater reliance on adjunct faculty in many cases, and that can result in diminished opportunity to be involved in research, diminished opportunity to have a relationship that is sustained with a faculty member as an advisor that's sustained over multiple years if that adjunct faculty member is really only hired term to term or year to year. So I do think there are implications, but we have systems and structures in place via accreditation, via sort of faculty control and oversight of curricular and academic matters, degree standards, et cetera, that I am very confident in Oregon, and I expect many other places are preserving sort of core academic quality at our institutions, and I don't think we have any evidence that it has declined.
So I can jump in to congratulate you on navigating that question, because you never want to hear your SHEO say, oh no, our quality is declining. And I didn't mean in my comments to imply that there's something inherently different about the quality of adjuncts or contingent faculty, but it is a trend that is going on. There is some evidence about what this means in classrooms for the very reasons that Ben mentioned about long-term relationships, advising, mentoring, seeing representation in the classroom. And it's something to watch for, right? We're such a people heavy business, or business is really the wrong term for higher ed, but as we're treated like a business, and as we look at things like efficiencies and cost cutting and productivity, and how do we find employees at lower costs, right? So the wages of adjuncts, there's a clear gap there between that and tenure line faculty. We want to be worried about what that is. We very quickly erode into quality when there are budget cuts, and it's not the same as a business that's producing a thing and can have productivity increases. There's a famous economist, William Baumol, who talked about what's termed now Baumol's disease, but in the arts and in other sectors, his famous example was of the string quartet, and music that was written by Mozart, played in the year that he wrote it, still played today. And if you move from the quartet to, take a violin or a viola out, the music itself changes. And we're very much the same in higher ed, right? We start moving into different areas or disconnecting a human element within the teaching and learning function. And we very quickly start eroding quality. And it's something that we need to be careful of within this sector, as opposed to other things that states do, where we might be able to expect to have productivity increases, but not necessarily in education, either at the K-12 or the higher ed level.
Thank you both. I would just add quickly to that there is ample evidence that state funding and total revenues at institutions impact student outcomes. I don't know how much we know those exact mechanisms and if it does have anything to do with quality, but there is a big importance for both having state funding and having just adequate total revenue to educate students. With that, I wish we could keep this conversation going, but we are at time. So thank you, Dr. Delaney. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Kelsey, for joining us today. Thank you again to the Hunt Institute for hosting this webinar series and discussion. I will now turn the floor back over to Dr. Madeline Smith for some closing remarks.
Well, thanks so much, Sophia, and thanks again to Kelsey, Ben, and Dr. Delaney for engaging this wonderful discussion today. As a reminder, you can find a video of this webinar on both our Facebook and YouTube pages. So before closing out today's discussion, I would like to remind everyone about our upcoming webinar series. On Wednesday, August 31st at 2 p.m., we will be kicking off the first webinar in a 3-part series focused on the role of community colleges in post-secondary attainment. The link to register is in the chat, and we hope to see you there. So thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you in August.